A 7-year-old girl is locked in a dark closet. She's screaming. No one comes. This is not a scene from a movie. This is the real childhood of the woman the world would later call Marilyn Monroe. And what happened to her before she ever stepped in front of a camera was so disturbing that for decades, Hollywood buried it, studios rewrote it, and her own biography was sanitized into a fairy tale. Today, we're pulling back the curtain, because the real story of Norma Jean Baker is darker, sadder, and more shocking than anything the tabloids ever printed. By the time she was 9 years old, she had already been abandoned by her mother, shuffled between strangers, and according to her own later statements, sexually abused by a man entrusted to care for her. She would spend years bouncing through foster homes and an orphanage, watching her mother get dragged away in a straitjacket, and growing up believing nobody on earth actually wanted her. This is the part of Marilyn Monroe's story that the glossy magazine covers never showed you. Stay with us, because by the end of this video you will never look at her smile the same way again. On June 1, 1926, in Los Angeles General Hospital, a baby girl was born and named Norma Jean Mortensen. There was no father in the room. There would never really be one in her life. Her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker, was a film negative cutter at a Hollywood studio, a woman who moved fast through marriages and relationships, and who was already showing the early, terrifying signs of a mental illness that would eventually destroy her. Gladys could not care for her daughter. Almost immediately after birth, baby Norma Jean was handed off to foster parents, a devout, strict couple named Albert and Ida Bollender, who lived in Hawthorne, California. Gladys paid them a small weekly fee to raise her daughter. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. This was the beginning of a lifelong pattern. A pattern of being given away. For the first 7 years of her life, Norma Jean believed the Bollenders were her real parents. She called Ida Mama. She had no idea the woman who occasionally visited on weekends, a stylish, distant figure named Gladys, was actually her birth mother. Can you imagine the psychological earthquake when she finally found out the truth? When Norma Jean was around 7 years old, Gladys finally pulled her out of the Bollender home and brought her to live together for the first time. For a few fragile months, it looked like the little girl might finally have a real family. Gladys even bought a small house near the Hollywood Bowl and took in lodgers to help pay the bills. But that fragile peace shattered almost instantly. Gladys's mental health collapsed. She suffered a violent breakdown and was forcibly taken to Los Angeles General Hospital's psychiatric ward. Witnesses later described her screaming and resisting as she was restrained. Norma Jean, just a small child, watched her mother dragged away, and she never lived with her again. Gladys would spend most of the rest of her life in and out of mental institutions, eventually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. The girl who would become the most photographed woman on earth had just lost her mother for good, and she was barely old enough to read. What happened next would shape her entire psyche, and it's the part biographers still argue about today. With Gladys institutionalized, a family friend named Grace McKee Goddard stepped in as legal guardian. Grace genuinely seemed to care about Norma Jean, but her own chaotic life, multiple marriages, financial struggles, meant the little girl was constantly shuffled from house to house, family to family. Some reports document as many as 10 to 12 different placements throughout her childhood, though the exact number has long been disputed by historians trying to untangle the conflicting stories Marilyn herself told later in life. It's in this period that the darkest allegation of her entire childhood emerges. In multiple interviews later in her career, including a now-famous conversation published decades after her death, Marilyn described being sexually assaulted by a male boarder in one of the homes she lived in when she was around 8 years old. She said she tried to tell the family, and instead of being believed, she was punished, accused of lying, and made to feel like the abuse was somehow her fault. This detail alone explains so much about the woman she became. A childhood where speaking the truth got you punished instead of protected. A childhood where the adults meant to shield you instead silenced you. Some biographers have questioned the precise details and timeline of her account over the years. But what's beyond dispute is this: the trauma Marilyn carried about her childhood, whatever its exact specifics, was real, deep, and something she spoke about with visible pain for the rest of her life. In 1935, when she was around 9 years old, things got even bleaker. Grace could no longer keep up with caring for her, and Norma Jean was placed in the Los Angeles Orphans' Home Society. Picture this: a 9-year-old girl walking into an orphanage, sobbing, reportedly insisting through tears that she wasn't an orphan, that her mother was still alive. Staff had to explain that there simply wasn't another option. She lived there for roughly 2 years. Decades later, She would describe this period of her life in heartbreakingly simple terms, saying that nobody seemed to want her and that she just wanted somebody, anybody, to love her. Those aren't the words of a glamorous movie star. Those are the words of an abandoned child, desperate for basic human connection. Words that the polished Hollywood biography pages conveniently left out for years. The orphanage years were followed by yet more foster placements, more strange houses, more unfamiliar faces calling themselves family for a while before passing her along again. By the time she reached her teenage years, Norma Jean had lived in so many different homes that she struggled to remember them all in later interviews. This is the part of the story that should stop you in your tracks. Before she was ever famous, before she was ever glamorous, she was simply a little girl nobody would keep. By 1942, Grace Goddard and her husband were relocating out of state, and they couldn't take 16-year-old Norma Jean with them. The terrifying alternative on the table was being sent right back into the orphanage system. So an arrangement was made that today would horrify most people. Norma Jean married a 21-year-old neighbor named James Dougherty. She was just 16 years old. It wasn't a romantic fairy tale wedding. It was, by most accounts, a practical solution to keep a teenage girl out of state custody. Dougherty later said he genuinely loved her, and the marriage wasn't without affection, but it began as an escape hatch from a system that had already failed her over and over again. Within a few years, as Dougherty shipped out for military service during World War II, Norma Jean took a factory job, and that's where, almost by accident, a photographer discovered her, and the slow transformation toward Marilyn Monroe began. But here's the chilling part very few people stop to consider. The woman the entire world would soon fall in love with. The one selling out movie premieres, gracing magazine covers, captivating presidents and millionaires, had never actually experienced a stable, loving childhood home. Not once. Not for a single consistent year of her life. Psychologists and biographers have spent decades analyzing how this chaotic, unstable, frightening childhood shaped the public figure Marilyn Monroe eventually became. And the patterns are impossible to ignore. A desperate need to be loved and approved of by strangers. Crippling anxiety hidden behind a dazzling public smile. Difficulty trusting people close to her, paired with an almost childlike eagerness to please everyone around her. Severe insomnia and reliance on medication that would tragically follow her until her final days. Friends and co-stars frequently noted the jarring contrast between the bubbly, radiant Marilyn audiences saw on screen and the anxious, deeply insecure woman they encountered behind closed doors. Acting coach Lee Strasberg, who worked closely with her for years, once remarked that he had only encountered that level of raw, untapped emotional talent in a handful of people in his entire career, talent he believed was directly tied to the depth of pain she carried inside. This wasn't a coincidence. This was cause and effect. A little girl who learned at a heartbreakingly young age that she had to perform, charm, and please in order to survive, grew into a woman who built an entire career, and ultimately an entire global icon, out of exactly that survival skill. So why didn't the public know the full extent of this for so long? Because the old studio system was built on manufactured images, not messy truths. When 20th Century Fox signed her, they didn't want a story about an abandoned, possibly abused orphan with a mother locked in a psychiatric hospital. That narrative didn't sell tickets in the conservative climate of post-war Hollywood, so the studio machine smoothed everything over, focusing on her looks, her charm, her bubbly persona, while quietly burying the darker chapters. It would take decades, well after her death in 1962, for biographers, journalists, and eventually Marilyn's own surviving interview tapes and letters to slowly piece together just how brutal her early years truly were. Even now, new details occasionally surface from archives, estate releases, and rediscovered interviews, continuing to reshape how the public understands her. Each revelation forces us to ask the same uncomfortable question: how much more was hidden, and why did it take so long to come out? This isn't just a sad footnote in a celebrity biography. It fundamentally reframes everything we thought we knew about Marilyn Monroe. For decades, she was reduced to a sex symbol, a punchline, a tragic blonde bombshell whose struggles were treated as scandal rather than the predictable consequences of severe, sustained childhood trauma. Understanding her early years forces a complete re-evaluation of her later life, her struggles with addiction, her turbulent marriages, her battles with studios who saw her as replaceable, and ultimately the devastating circumstances surrounding her death. Mental health advocates today increasingly point to her story as a textbook example of how unaddressed childhood trauma can follow a person, however successful, however beautiful, however beloved, straight into adulthood, and how an industry obsessed with image can actively prevent that pain from ever being properly treated. There have been renewed calls in recent years, from biographers, documentary filmmakers, and mental health professionals alike, for the entertainment industry to stop romanticizing the suffering of stars like Marilyn, and instead use her story as a warning about what happens when fame is built on top of untreated, unspoken trauma. So where does this leave us now? Interest in the real, unfiltered story of Marilyn Monroe has only grown stronger in recent years, fueled by new documentaries, newly surfaced letters, and renewed scrutiny of how the studio system treated vulnerable young women. Estate archives continue to release previously unseen material, and each new discovery adds another piece to a puzzle that may never be fully complete, because so much of her early life was undocumented, scattered across foster records, hospital files, and the fading memories of people who are no longer alive to confirm them. What we do know is this: the story Hollywood sold the world for decades was never the full picture. The radiant, giggling movie star photographed at countless premieres was built on top of a foundation of abandonment, instability, and pain that started before she could even walk into a school classroom. The next time someone shows you that iconic photo, the white dress, the wind, the smile that lit up the entire world, remember the 7-year-old girl who didn't know her own mother's face, the 8-year-old who says she was assaulted and not believed, the 9-year-old crying at the orphanage door insisting she wasn't alone in the world. Marilyn Monroe spent her entire adult life trying to convince the world she was loved, because nobody ever truly convinced her of it as a child. That's the real story behind the icon, and it's a story Hollywood spent decades trying to keep hidden. If this video opened your eyes to the truth behind the legend, make sure you're subscribed and notifications are turned on, because there is more of this hidden history coming, and you do not want to miss what we uncover next.